Cast out of his childhood home with nothing but his late father's ailing hound, Thomas thought his life was over. He was relegated to a decaying dog-house on the property line. But what that loyal dog unearthed beneath the dirt floor would shatter his greedy family's empire forever. Grief hung heavy in the mahogany-paneled office of Jonathan Gable, the premier estate attorney for the wealthy elite of the Hudson Valley. Rain lashed against the towering windows, a fitting backdrop for the devastating betrayal about to unfold. Thomas Whitaker sat rigidly in a leather wingback chair, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. Beside him sat his older brother Richard, who appeared remarkably composed for a man who had just buried their father, Charles Whitaker, the legendary textile magnate. For the past 5 years, Thomas had put his own life and career on hold. While Richard was off in Europe, squandering his generous allowance on sports cars and lavish parties, Thomas had remained at the Oakhaven estate, acting as a full-time caretaker for their father, as a brutal neurodegenerative disease slowly robbed Charles of his independence. Thomas had fed him, bathed him, and sat awake through countless agonizing nights, his only companion being Barnaby, a massive, droopy-eared bloodhound mix who had been Charles's shadow. Thomas loved his father deeply and expected nothing in return, but he certainly did not expect the devastating shock of the final will and testament. Jonathan Gable adjusted his spectacles, his expression entirely devoid of empathy. He cleared his throat and began reading a heavily amended document dated just 3 weeks prior to Charles's death, a period when the old man's mind was heavily clouded by pain medication. To Richard, the firstborn, went the entirety of the Whitaker textile fortune, the liquid assets, the investment portfolios, and the sprawling 40-acre Oakhaven estate, complete with its 20-room mansion, manicured gardens, and imported marble fountains. Thomas listened in stunned silence as millions of dollars and generations of family legacy were handed exclusively to the brother who had not bothered to visit their dying father for over 2 years. Then came Thomas's inheritance. Gable's eyes flicked over the paper, a slight frown marring his forehead. According to the bizarre addendum, Thomas was to inherit exactly 2 things. The first was Barnaby, the aging bloodhound. The second was the historic canine kennel structure, located at the absolute edge of the southern property line, along with a 10-foot radius of land surrounding it. The doghouse. Thomas asked, his voice, barely a whisper, echoing in the cavernous office. He left me the doghouse. Richard let out a sharp, cruel bark of laughter. Well, little brother, it seems fitting. You always did prefer playing nursemaid and keeping company with animals. Father simply formalized your station in life. Thomas tried to protest, demanding to see the signatures questioning his father's mental competence at the time the amendment was drafted, but Gable coldly informed him that multiple medical experts conveniently hired by Richard had certified Charles as of sound mind. Fighting it in court would take millions money Thomas simply didn't possess. The eviction was swift and merciless. Within 24 hours of the will's reading, Richard had hired private security to escort Thomas off the main premises. Thomas was given exactly 1 hour to pack his personal belongings into a couple of duffel bags. As he walked down the grand sweeping staircase for the last time, Barnaby limping faithfully at his side, Richard stood by the front door, sipping a glass of expensive scotch. "Make sure you stay on your side of the boundary line." "Tommy," Richard sneered, swirling the amber liquid. "If I catch you or that flea-bitten mutt wandering onto my estate, I'll have you arrested for trespassing. Enjoy your new palace." The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind him. The sound was a definitive end to his old life. Carrying his meager possessions, Thomas walked a mile through the freezing autumn rain toward the southern edge of the estate. The historic canine kennel was a relic from the late 1800s built by their great-grandfather to house a pack of fox-hunting hounds. It had been abandoned for decades. While technically a building, it was barely fit for human habitation. It was a sturdy, low-slung stone structure with a rotted wooden roof measuring perhaps 15 by 20 feet. The windows were shattered, the heavy wooden door was hanging off its rusted hinges, and the interior floor was nothing but packed frozen dirt, covered in decades of fallen leaves and debris. Stepping inside, the air was damp and smelled of decay. Thomas dropped his bags onto the dirt floor and sank to his knees, burying his face in his hands. The sheer cruelty of his father's final act was incomprehensible. Why would Charles do this? Had the dementia twisted his mind so thoroughly that he believed Richard was the dutiful son? Or had Richard orchestrated a masterful manipulation, forging documents and bribing doctors? Barnaby let out a low, mournful whine. The large dog pressed his cold, wet nose against Thomas's cheek, offering the only comfort left in the world. Thomas wrapped his arms around the hound's thick neck, tears finally mingling with the rain on his face. "It's just you and me now, buddy." Thomas choked out, shivering, as a gust of wind howled through the broken windows. "Just you and me." Over the next 3 days, Thomas worked tirelessly to make the stone shack survivable. He gathered fallen branches and used a tarp found in the woods to patch the gaping holes in the roof. He built a small, crude fire pit just outside the door to boil water and cook cheap canned beans he bought with the last few dollars in his checking account. Every night, he and Barnaby huddled together beneath a pile of old blankets, sharing their body heat to stave off the biting autumn frost. He was broken, destitute, and completely isolated, staring up at the rotting wooden beams of his new home, wondering how long he could possibly survive this living nightmare. Winter approached with a brutal swiftness, turning the ground of the Hudson Valley into iron. Survival in the stone kennel became a daily, grueling battle against the elements. Thomas managed to secure part-time work at a local hardware store in town, walking 3 miles each way, just to earn enough cash to buy dog food for Barnaby and basic rations for himself. Meanwhile, just a mile up the hill, Richard was living like a king. The Oakhaven estate was constantly ablaze with lights. Almost every weekend, luxury cars would line the winding driveway for extravagant parties that lasted until dawn. Sometimes, when the wind blew just right, Thomas could hear the faint, mocking sounds of orchestral music and the clinking of champagne glasses. Adding insult to injury, Richard had a tall, imposing chain-link fence erected precisely 10 feet around the stone dog house, physically caging Thomas into his miserable little plot of land. Despite the grim circumstances, Barnaby seemed strangely rejuvenated. When they first moved into the shack, the old hound had been lethargic, barely able to walk due to his advanced age and arthritis. But as the weeks passed, Barnaby began exhibiting a bizarre, almost manic energy. It started in the back right corner of the shack. One freezing evening in late November, Thomas returned from the hardware store, exhausted and shivering. He found Barnaby fiercely scratching at the hard-packed dirt floor in the darkest corner of the stone building. The dog was whining, his large paws kicking up dust and loose soil. "Hey, stop that!" Thomas scolded, gently pulling the dog away. "You're going to ruin your paws, Barnaby." The dog obeyed, but only temporarily. The next night, Thomas woke up to the sound of rhythmic scratching in the pitch dark. He struck a match and lit his single kerosene lantern, only to find Barnaby back in the same corner, digging with frantic determination. The dog had managed to hollow out a shallow depression in the freezing dirt. This behavior continued for a week. No matter how many times Thomas filled the hole back in, Barnaby would wait until Thomas was asleep, or at work and resume his excavation. The dog's obsession was unshakable. He would skip meals, ignore treats, and refuse to go outside for walks, choosing instead to stand guard over the corner, sniffing the dirt and letting out sharp, anxious barks. By the second week of December, the temperature dropped below 0. Thomas was bordering on despair. His small space heater was broken, and his bank account was entirely empty. As he sat huddled under his blankets, watching his breath form white clouds in the freezing air, he looked over at Barnaby. The dog was once again digging his paws raw and bleeding slightly from the frozen earth. Something inside Thomas snapped. It wasn't anger. It was a profound, desperate curiosity. Barnaby was not a stupid animal. The dog had spent years at Charles's side, walking these very grounds. Why was he so determined to tear up this specific patch of dirt? Throwing off his blankets, Thomas grabbed a rusted trowel he had found in the woods and walked over to the corner. "All right," Thomas muttered, his teeth chattering. "Let's see what you're making such a fuss about." Thomas knelt in the dirt and began to dig. The earth was heavily compacted, layered with decades of hardened mud and small stones. It was back-breaking work. Hours passed. His hands blistered and cracked in the cold, but the physical exertion kept him warm. Barnaby sat right beside him, watching intently, occasionally nudging Thomas's arm with his snout as if to encourage him to keep going. About 3 feet down, the trowel struck something hard. It wasn't a rock. It made a dull metallic clank that echoed sharply in the small stone structure. Thomas froze, his heart suddenly hammering against his ribs. He dropped the trowel and used his bare, bleeding hands to frantically clear away the loose soil. Buried in the earth was a heavy, dark green metal box, roughly the size of a large footlocker. It was coated in mud and rust, wrapped securely in thick chains, and sealed with a heavy brass padlock. Panting heavily, Thomas grabbed a heavy stone from the ruined threshold of the door and brought it down on the rusted padlock with all his remaining strength. Crack! He hit it again. Crack! On the fourth strike, the brittle metal shattered. Thomas pulled the chains away. They fell heavily into the dirt. With trembling hands, he grabbed the latches of the metal locker and pried the heavy lid open. The dim light of the kerosene lantern cascaded into the box, reflecting off something so incredibly bright that Thomas physically recoiled. Gold. The box was filled to the brim with neatly stacked rows of solid gold coins. They were American double eagles impeccably preserved, gleaming with a heavy, intoxicating luster. There had to be hundreds, maybe thousands of them. The sheer weight of the fortune sitting in the dirt was staggering. But it wasn't just the gold that made Thomas's breath catch in his throat. Resting gently on top of the dazzling piles of coins was a thick, sealed envelope made of high-quality parchment. Thomas recognized the stationery immediately. It was his father's personal letterhead. With shaking fingers, Thomas reached into the box and picked up the envelope. His name was written across the front, in his father's elegant, sweeping handwriting. It was dated 5 years ago, long before the dementia had taken hold, long before the altered will, and right around the time Thomas had first moved home to become his caretaker. Barnaby let out a soft, satisfied woof, resting his heavy chin on the edge of the gold-filled box. Thomas stared at the letter, realizing in that freezing, life-altering moment that his father's mind hadn't been twisted by illness when he left him this decaying dog-house. It had been the sharpest, most calculated move Charles Whittaker had ever made. Tearing the envelope open with mud-caked fingers, Thomas pulled out 3 crisp pages of thick parchment. His breath plumed in the freezing air as he held the pages close to the kerosene lantern. Barnaby nudged his elbow, seemingly satisfied, before curling up on the tarp nearby. "My dearest Thomas." The letter began, written in the steady, commanding hand his father possessed before the illness took its toll. If you are reading this, it means two things. First, that I am dead. Second, that my loyal Barnaby has guided you to the truth I could not speak aloud. I owe you an apology, my son, for the humiliation you undoubtedly suffered at the reading of my will. Tears pricked Thomas's eyes as he continued reading. Charles explained that he had known about Richard's true nature for years. He knew Richard had secretly colluded with Jonathan Gable to slowly siphon funds from the family's offshore accounts. Charles realized that his eldest son was a parasite, intent on liquidating the family legacy the moment Charles passed away. Because of the corporate structures and the board of directors, I knew Richard would tie up my assets in litigation for decades if I tried to disinherit him entirely. The letter detailed. He had already begun paying off doctors to declare me incompetent if I altered the estate trust in your favor. So I played the fool. I allowed him to believe he had won. I gave him the estate, the stock options, and the public accounts. But what Richard did not know is that I spent the last 3 years quietly converting the vast majority of my private wealth into untraceable gold. Charles had meticulously orchestrated the entire charade. He legally severed the historic canine kennel from the main property deed, turning it into a distinct parcel of land. He knew Richard's monumental ego would view the dog house as a perfect insult, a fitting punishment for the brother who chose duty over ambition. Richard would never look twice at the crumbling stone structure, let alone dig up its floor. Inside this box is exactly $25 million in rare American double eagles, the letter concluded. They are completely untraceable, and legally yours, sitting on land that you own free and clear. Use it wisely. Reclaim our legacy. I love you, Thomas. Give Barnaby a scratch behind the ears for me. Silence filled the freezing stone shack, broken only by the whistling wind outside. Thomas sat completely paralyzed, the sheer magnitude of his father's genius washing over him. His father had not abandoned him. He had masterminded the ultimate checkmate from beyond the grave. Overwhelming relief gave way to a cold, razor-sharp determination. Thomas carefully packed the letter back into the envelope and buried the box under the dirt once more, packing it down tightly. He dragged his heavy duffel bags over the disturbed earth to hide any signs of digging. He could not just march into a bank with millions in rare gold coins without raising suspicions. He needed a bulletproof plan. Early the next morning, Thomas walked into town and used his last paycheck from the hardware store to buy a cheap burner phone and a bus ticket to Manhattan. His destination was the law firm of Arthur Pendleton, a notoriously aggressive corporate litigator who despised Jonathan Gable with a fiery passion. Pendleton was known as a shark who only took cases he could weaponize. Sitting in Pendleton's ultra-modern glass office, high above Lexington Avenue, Thomas laid a single gold double eagle on the mahogany desk. He explained the entire situation, the altered will, Gable's complicity, the hidden box, and the letters. Pendleton picked up the gold coin, a predatory grin spreading across his face. Gable always was a sloppy, arrogant fool, the lawyer murmured, inspecting the heavy gold. Your father, on the other hand, was a ghost-level genius. This gold is completely unattached to the probate estate. By legally carving out that plot of land before his cognitive decline, he gave you a tax-free, unassailable fortune. Forming a blind trust took less than a week. Pendleton established a shell corporation named Iluridae Holdings, nodding to the red pandas Thomas always admired in wildlife documentaries. Through this corporate entity, Pendleton began carefully liquidating the gold coins through elite private auction houses in Switzerland and London, ensuring the sudden influx of cash could never be traced back to the ruined heir living in a doghouse. Months passed, bringing the spring thaw to the Hudson Valley. Thomas continued living in the stone shack, playing the part of the broken, destitute brother. He still chopped wood, still cooked over an open fire, and still walked Barnaby along the chain-link fence Richard had so spitefully erected. Up on the hill, Richard was enthusiastically digging his own grave. Just as Charles had predicted, Richard's staggering arrogance blinded him to his financial realities. He liquidated the Whitaker textile factories at a massive loss to fund his exorbitant lifestyle. He bought a yacht he couldn't afford, invested heavily in disastrous tech startups, and threw parties that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars a weekend. Gable, feeding off Richard's incompetence, was quietly draining the accounts through exorbitant legal consultation fees. Watching from the shadows of his small plot of land, Thomas waited patiently. He had $25 million sitting safely in a diversified offshore portfolio, growing every day. He hired private investigators to track Richard's spiraling debts, documenting every missed mortgage payment, every leveraged loan, and every desperate attempt to keep the sinking ship afloat. Justice was not going to be a quick, violent explosion. It was going to be a slow, agonizing suffocation for the brother who had cast him out into the cold. Every afternoon, Thomas would sit on an old tree stump outside the kennel, petting Barnaby, while reviewing the thick dossiers Pendleton sent him via a secure courier. The documents painted a picture of absolute financial carnage. Richard had leveraged Oakhaven Estate itself, taking out a massive high-interest loan from a ruthless private equity firm to cover his mounting gambling debts. "He is bleeding out," Thomas Pendleton noted during one of their encrypted phone calls. "Gable is trying to jump ship, but we've already frozen his assets by launching a shadow investigation into his firm's accounting practices. Your brother is isolated. The banks are preparing to foreclose on the mansion within the next 60 days. Smiling grimly, Thomas tossed a stick for Barnaby to fetch. The trap was set. It was almost time to spring it. Summer arrived with oppressive heat, mirroring the boiling pressure inside the walls of the Oakhaven mansion. Rumors were swirling around the elite country clubs that Richard Whitaker was entirely broke. Creditors were circling like vultures, calling the estate daily, threatening severe legal action. The luxurious sports cars were quietly repossessed in the dead of night. The groundskeepers and private chefs quit after their paychecks bounced for the third consecutive week. Through his shell corporation, Thomas purchased Richard's defaulted debt for pennies on the dollar. He essentially became his brother's sole creditor. When the private equity firm initiated the foreclosure proceedings, Alluride Holdings was perfectly positioned to swallow the Oakhaven estate whole. August 14th marked the day of the public auction. It was held on the courthouse steps in a humiliating, highly publicized spectacle. Richard didn't even show up, hiding inside the sprawling empty mansion with the curtains drawn. Pendleton, acting as the proxy for the mysterious Alluride Holdings, purchased the entire 40-acre property, the mansion and all its contents, for a fraction of its true value. Eviction notices were served immediately. Richard was given exactly 48 hours to vacate the premises. Moving day arrived under a blanket of heavy grey clouds. Thomas shaved for the first time in 10 months. He put on a sharply tailored dark navy suit he had secretly purchased in Manhattan. Barnaby, wearing a brand-new leather collar with solid brass hardware, sat dutifully at his side. Together they walked out of the 10-foot chain-link enclosure that had been their prison and crossed onto the sprawling main estate. Walking up the long, sweeping driveway felt surreal. Weeds were already sprouting through the pristine cobblestones. The manicured gardens were overgrown and wild. When Thomas reached the grand front entrance, a moving truck was parked awkwardly on the grass. Men were hauling out cheap suitcases and garbage bags filled with designer clothes. Standing by the front door, looking pale, disheveled, and completely broken, was Richard. He was yelling frantically into his cell phone, begging Jonathan Gable to return his calls. When Richard finally looked up and saw Thomas approaching, his expression morphed from desperation to absolute fury. "What are you doing here?" Richard spat, dropping his phone. "Did you come to gloat, or did you come to beg for scraps before the bank throws us both out on the street? Get back to your shack, you pathetic loser." Pendleton stepped out from behind a massive marble pillar, carrying a sleek leather briefcase. He walked over and stood respectfully beside Thomas. "Mr. Whitaker," Pendleton said, addressing Richard with a voice dripping with icy contempt. "I believe you are speaking to the legal owner of this property. I strongly advise you to watch your tone while on my client's land." Confusion rippled across Richard's face. He looked from the fierce corporate lawyer to his younger brother, taking in Thomas's expensive suit and the aura of quiet, unshakable confidence radiating from him. "Your client," Richard stammered, stepping back. "What are you talking about? A private firm bought this estate, Alluridae Holdings. Alluridae is the biological family name for the red panda," Thomas said, softly, his voice echoing in the grand foyer. "I always liked red pandas. They are resilient creatures." Color completely drained from Richard's face as the realization hit him with the force of a freight train. He staggered backward, catching himself on the heavy oak doorframe. "You!" Richard whispered, his eyes wide with horror and disbelief. "How you had nothing. I left you in a doghouse with a dying mutt. You didn't have a dime to your name. Father knew exactly who you were." "Richard," Thomas replied, stepping closer, Barnaby letting out a low, menacing growl at the older brother. "He knew you would destroy everything he built. He knew you would try to leave me with nothing. But he was 10 steps ahead of you. That doghouse you so generously allowed me to keep, it was sitting on a gold mine. Literally." Gasping for air, Richard fell to his knees on the marble floor. The arrogance that had defined his entire life was completely shattered, replaced by the crushing weight of his own profound failure. He had thrown away a legacy while the brother he despised had quietly orchestrated a masterstroke of revenge. "Please!" Richard begged, tears streaming down his face as he looked up at Thomas. "Tommy, please. I have nowhere to go. I owe terrible people a lot of money. You can't just throw me out into the street. We are brothers." Looking down at the weeping man, Thomas felt no anger, only a deep, echoing pity. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a single, crisp $100 bill, letting it flutter to the marble floor in front of Richard's knees. "Make sure you stay off my property, Richard," Thomas said, repeating the exact words his brother had weaponized a year ago. "If I catch you wandering onto my estate, I'll have you arrested for trespassing." Without another word, Thomas turned his back on his brother and walked into the grand mansion. The air inside was stale, smelling of neglect and cheap liquor, but it was home. He walked straight into his father's old study, the very room where Jonathan Gable had delivered that fateful rigged will. Settling into the leather wingback chair behind the massive oak desk, Thomas let out a long, shuddering breath. The nightmare was finally over. He had honored his father's final wish, protected the family legacy, and secured a future he never thought possible. Barnaby limped slowly into the office, his tail wagging softly. The old hound walked around the desk and collapsed onto an expensive Persian rug, resting his heavy head on his paws. Thomas smiled, reaching down to scratch the dog right behind his velvety ears. "Good boy, Barnaby," Thomas whispered, looking out the towering windows at his sprawling domain. "You are a very, very good boy." Sunlight broke through the heavy grey clouds outside, casting a golden glow across the rolling hills of the Hudson Valley. Thomas knew the road ahead would require immense work. He had to rebuild the textile empire from the ashes, rehire the loyal staff that Richard had alienated, and restore the Oakhaven estate to its former glory. He planned to transform the crumbling stone kennel at the edge of the property into a beautiful heated sanctuary for rescued senior dogs, a tribute to the loyal Hound that had saved his life. Justice had been served cold, sharp, and exact. Out of the dirt and despair, a new legacy had been forged, protected by the enduring bond between a father, a son, and a brilliant, faithful dog. What an absolutely incredible turn of events. Thomas went from freezing in a decaying shack to reclaiming his billion-dollar empire, proving that loyalty and patience always defeat greed. If this unbelievable true story of ultimate revenge and hidden treasure left you speechless, smash that like button. Right now, share this video with a fellow dog lover who appreciates sweet justice, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more jaw-dropping real-life mysteries and revenge stories.